Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today I want to talk about Dungeons & Dragons 5th Edition and how I'm pretty sure we've reached a point where Dungeons & Dragons has also lost the dungeon. Alright, so let's get into this. So I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but Dungeons & Dragons does a lot of studies about itself. And then they adjust if people aren't perceiving the game the way they want them to, then they'll adjust, okay? So they did a study many years ago, and they said, hey, and they were like, they asked people, what do you think of Dungeons & Dragons? And they're like, I like the dungeons, I see the dungeons, I'm in the dungeons, but I never see the dragons. Where are they, right? And Dungeons & Dragons is like, oh, that's a real problem. You are 100% telling the truth there. That is quite real, the problem you were talking about. So what's the problem? Where were the dragons, right? Well, dragons don't show up a lot in Dungeons & Dragons. You know why? When dragons show up, people die. Right? Those things are absolute wrecking machines, and basically you can't put a dragon anywhere near, right, a core 4, group who isn't even at least level 8, at least, right? And even if you do that, one or two of them are going to die, and maybe one or two will live, right? So dragons are so dangerous, they almost never show up in a game, right? Now that's old hat. They've known that for like 15 years. And just so you're aware, Dragonborn were born in, I think Dragonborn came out in 4th edition. Yes, I think Dragonborn came out in 4th edition, and that was in like 2008, and it was specifically to address the issue that dragons were not in the game very much, right? Like, people didn't really encounter them. Well, guess what? The reality is Dragonborns didn't really put dragons in the game. They didn't, right? Like, just because you got a humanoid with some scales don't mean you got a dragon on the scene, right? And the reality is dragons were never really put back into Dungeons & Dragons. It was acknowledged as an issue. They attempted to fix it. Good try. I don't think, hey, it's okay to fail, right? Like, it's much better to try and fail than to not try at all, okay? But I do think Dragonborns were a failure in putting dragons into Dungeons & Dragons, right? And the reality is dragons don't show up in Dungeons & Dragons so much. But guess what? We just arrived in a world where dungeons don't really show up in Dungeons & Dragons much anymore, right? And I think it's time to acknowledge it, right? So why am I acknowledging it now? In Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, I don't think we see dungeons very much. We really don't, right? So let me make my case. So first of all, the reason we're talking about this right now is the Paramount 2023 movie. We now know the plot of it, right? And it's gonna be dealing with the Lord of Neverwinter, and I think it's gonna take place pretty much in Neverwinter. Okay, from the description of the story, we're gonna be looking at a Neverwinter story, right? And so the player characters are gonna be spending a lot of time, most likely, in a city, right? Now, for a modern movie, this makes a lot of sense. Cities are incredibly dynamic, right? You can have the sewers and get everything you need from a dungeons in the sewers of the Neverwinter city. Even the lower levels of the city will function as like gritty, dark places, right? Fine, cool. But even beyond that, you can, in the same city, you can just scale up to the heights of the city, and you could be dealing with princes and princesses and magic and wizards and beautiful libraries, right? Cities are incredibly dope, right? And we definitely resonate with them in modern life because we have them, right? We understand them, and they're so complex and so amazing. Unlike a dungeon, which is dark and swampy and like dark and smelly and closed, right? So I think modern viewers have a tough time really interacting with dungeons because they're so limited, right? But at this point, we now have a game where the things it's named for rarely show up, right? And I know what you're going to say. You're going to say, "Hey, Scott, what about the Mad Mountain Underwater Deep or whatever that nonsense hardback book was?" Yeah, there's 30 books out, and one of them is a traditional dungeon, right? And I think they made that thing because they literally reached a point where they're like, "Holy crap! Dungeons & Dragons doesn't even have any dungeon." Any dungeon adventures, right? And think about the adventures like Baldur's Gate Ascent to Avernus and Strahd, Curse of Strahd, and Princes of the Apocalypse and Horde of the Dragon Queen. Like, none of these really have Thunderstorm, the Giant Thunderstorm. None of these things are traditional dungeons, right? So the reality is, it's sad face, right? Dungeons and Dragons really doesn't have any dungeons in it anymore, and it really doesn't have any dragons in it. Which just goes to show, it's more evidence of what I've been saying all along. You don't know what Dungeons and Dragons is. We're still finding that out. It is truly bizarre and wonderful and beautiful and mysterious. That's my opinion. What do you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Let me know in the comments below. Please consider liking and subscribing and have a wonderful millennium.